Hey class, in this video we are going to talk about CSS layout. This is going to be our last CSS video, so we'll update the layout of the page. We're going to be talking about some of the basics of CSS when it comes to layout. CSS has gotten very complex in terms of layout in the last few years, especially. And there's a lot of new sort of very sophisticated techniques for modern websites. We're not really going to get into that, one, because it's pretty complicated to explain in a short video like this one. And two, it's all kind of based on these basics. So if you don't really understand the basics, the more complex stuff is a lot harder to implement. And we're making a really simple website, so it's kind of overkill to make like a crazy layout. If you have questions about stuff like grid and flexbox and things like that, I'm happy to go over them, but I think it'll be good just to cover the basics for this course. So I'm going to talk about a few basic things like the display property, the box model, the width and height, and those properties, and we'll make a basic layout, and then we'll update our site on GitHub, and we'll update our make a new OpenLab post and put that on Brightspace. So we'll kind of wrap up our lessons for this week. Yeah, let's just get into it. So I'm going to go over to the website, and I kind of mentioned this a little bit previously, but if you hover over your elements in the developer tools, and if you don't remember how to open this, go to View and Developer, and go to Developer Tools, and make sure you have the Elements tab. If you're on like Console or something, you may not be able to see it, but you can click on here and see. You want to make sure to have the Elements tab. I'm going to hide myself because I'm going to be blocking a lot of this stuff. But if we look at the different elements, you'll see the box model down here. And you can kind of see, how the layout is being done. The highlighting is a little goofy with our black background, but that's okay. So one of the sort of main ways that we style a CSS page with the layout is our display property, which has a few different values, which don't always totally make sense together, but we'll take a look at those. So we can see for the body section, the default display is block. And if we type in display, another nice thing about the console is you can actually kind of like go through these different options here. So if I hit the up arrow, it'll actually kind of like show me all the different options for display. So there's quite a lot now. There didn't used to be this many, but let's just talk about a couple. So the default is block. What this means is that this content takes up the entire width of the page. So one of the main distinctions when it comes to layout is block versus inline. So a block element, no matter how much content it is, even if it just goes to here, it'll still stretch out to fill in the rest of the page. An inline element, if this is the content of the inline element, if there's an element next to it, it'll sit right next to it. So that's why, for example, the anchor tags sit next to the other text in the paragraph, even though it's its own tag. Versus paragraphs always take up the entire section, even if they end here. This gets filled in with the block, and we go to the next paragraph down here. So that's basically inline versus block. And so if we go back to our body section, or we type in display, and we can look at, here's the default block. I don't know what a lot of these are. Grid is kind of like one of the new ones that people use. Flex is also a new one that's pretty useful. But you can also see none means it doesn't display at all, which is sort of weird now. We also have a visibility property that we can use for that now that's a little bit more appropriate, but this was kind of one of the earlier rules. There's a bunch of other display styles that we won't really use. But for our body, we certainly aren't going to change the display at all. But you can see the same thing with the H1. So if I click on the H1 here and I go to display, if I set this to inline, nothing happens quite yet, but we lose that margin. That's another thing, is that inline elements don't have the margin and padding of the box model. But if I go to this paragraph and I change this to display inline as well, now you can see my paragraph goes right next to the header. So you might want to use that in some cases, but usually we want to stick with those defaults. So we're not actually going to change our display properties at all, but I just wanted to talk about those defaults. So next we can talk about the box model. So if I click on this H1, you'll see the box model down here. So there's the content in the middle, there's padding, which goes in between the content and the border, and there's margin, which goes on the outside. Our H1 has a default margin, and so it's on the top and the bottom. And you can see that rule here. So the default margin on the top is this 0.67, and on the bottom it's this 0.67. If I want to change that, I could say margin is 0, and you can see that margin on that H1 disappears. And if I did that with my paragraphs as well, if I said margin is 0, now everything is kind of squished together. If I set the margin to like 10 EM or something like that, no, let's just do 2 EM. Notice that if I set it just to one value, it applies on all 4 sides. So that's another way that we can shorten up, we can kind of like abbreviate our CSS, is if we write one rule, it'll apply to all the properties within that rule. And it's sort of there's a few different ways to do this. If I just do 1, it's going to apply to all of them. If I do 2, it'll do top and bottom and right and left. So you'll see if I do 2 EM and then I do 3 EM, you can see that the margin on the sides is bigger than the margin on the top and the bottom. So it'll start with top and then bottom and then right and left. So there's a few different ways to do this to kind of do shortcuts. Another thing I can do with my content is I can change the alignment. So I can say text align is center, and that might, look better depending on what your design for your page is. So we can kind of use these together. Another thing that we can do is add padding. And so to demonstrate this, we kind of need a border. So I'm going to add a border to my header. So I'll go to my H1 and I'll say border. And so there's a bunch of different rules for the border. So we can combine them again in sort of like a shorthand. But let's write them out and then I'll show you how to combine them. So we can set the border color. Actually, we don't need to set the color because it'll take the default color. But what we can do is set the border. What do we need? We need the border width. So if I set the border width to 1 pixel, we should see a border, but I might need the border style too. So let's set the border style to solid. This will just be a solid line. There we see the border. So it looks kind of weird, but we can style this up. So if we increase the width of the border, you can see it gets bigger. If we change the style, there's a few different styles, but they're not really going to help us much. This dotted and dashed don't really look that good. So let's stick with the solid border. We can also add a border radius. So if I add like a 3 pixel border radius, that'll make it a little bit rounded. And you can see it gets more rounded as I increase that value. But my width is really high, so it kind of looks weird. But one of the things you'll notice is that the border is right up against the text. Looks weird. So that's where padding comes in. Padding is like margin, except it comes between the text and the border. So if I set the padding to 1 EM, now it adds a little bit of space. If I do like 1 EM and like 0.5 EM, I can do more space on the sides versus the top. Or if I do 0.5 EM, like that looks a little bit better. And then if I do text align as center, that looks sort of halfway decent. And then if I want to do the margin is 1 EM, that's starting to look a little bit more interesting as far as our layout goes. I don't know how much you would want to use this, on a typical website, but this kind of demonstrates some of the basics. So let's go ahead and just copy all this into our CSS here. And so that looks pretty good. Another way that you can write the border is just using border by itself. And then the thing that's a little tricky to remember here is that the order of the arguments matter. So if I say 6 pixels solid, that should essentially be the same thing as width and style. So one of the sort of weird things that takes a while to get used to with CSS is you can actually combine these rules. You can do it with font as well. You can put a bunch of font rules together. I don't really recommend doing that when you're first getting started because it tends to confuse things. But for some things, it's just easier. Like for padding, you can write this instead of writing padding top is 1 EM, padding bottom, writing out all these rules. So sometimes it's kind of useful. Another thing that I would normally do with the layout is you can see that by default, an HTML page takes up the entire content of the page, regardless of how big the width of your window is. And I'm using the dev tools to show this, but you can show this just by changing the width of the window as well. So one of the things that we typically want to do is center our content. And there's different ways to do that. You can see I centered the text, and I could do that with my paragraphs as well. I could say for all of my paragraphs, I want text align center. But now all the paragraphs are centered. You might not really want it to look that way. So what I really want to do is a little bit more complex. So what I want to do is I want to take all of the content and I want to move it in a little bit and then center this block. And there's a lot of different ways to do this. I'm going to show you guys sort of the most basic way to do this. This is like the very typical way to do this. Because some things, like I could make all my paragraphs. I could go in here and say, margin is 0 and 2 EM. And so that adds a little bit of a margin, but it still kind of like gets bigger and smaller with the web page. What I want to do instead is put all of this content into what's called sometimes a wrap or a container. And so I actually need to add some HTML to do this. So I'm going to go back to my HTML page. And this is a very common thing to do. So I have the body section, which kind of determines, the whole website. But I want to have sections inside the website that aren't the whole website. So the thing that I use for this is a special HTML element called a div. This is like a division in a layout. When you have like different parts of the page, you might call these different divisions. So they're not specific pieces of content like a header or a paragraph, but they're more layout blocks to kind of divide up your page. So to do this, I just write div, and that's all it is. But we wrap this whole section in our div. And this is where, now I have to go back and hit tab to indent all of these to make it look good again. So this div is going to wrap up all our content. And a lot of websites, you might have like tons of divs. If you look at like the source code for a typical website, like let's look at our WordPress blog. If I go to view and go to view source, most of the elements you're going to see are div elements. So if I zoom in here and let's just scroll down past all the styles and stuff, here's where the body starts, and there's still some more styles and stuff. But here we start to see div, behind menu, div, page, div, site branding, div, menu button container, div, primary menu. Let's see, div, content, div, entry content, div. There's just tons of divs. So this just divides all of the blocks of our page. And if we look at the inspector on this page, if I go to view developer tools, if I start to inspect this page, you're going to see all these little divs contain different sections of the page. So here's the div ID page. That's the whole page. Inside here, they've got the header. That's a special section. Then I've got div ID content. Then I've got div primary. Then I've got main. Main is another special one. Article. And then div entry content, footer. In the entry content, we've got this div. Then we actually have our paragraphs. So all of these divs are these different blocks of the website. So let's make our div. So because there's so many divs, we have to specify what div we're talking about. And the way we do this is using an ID. So an ID is sort of like an identifier. It's sort of like your passport number or your social security number, something like that. It's something that only exists once. And we can call this whatever we want. Typically, you'll see either wrap for this div that I'm creating here or a container. And so the container kind of like contains this whole section. So we can style this div by using the ID. Because there's so many different divs, we can't just use the div selector like we do with our anchor or our H1. We need to use an ID. So we would say div and then ID, hashtag is for ID, and then we'd say container. And then we can add a rule that just applies to that one div, even though we only have one div. And so the rule I'm going to apply here is a margin rule, and it's a little trick rule where I'm going to say I want 0 margin on the top and bottom, and then I want auto margin on the right and left. So it's going to automatically calculate how big to make those margins. But for this to work, I need to set a width for my page. So I'm going to set a width. This is just the width in pixels, and I'm going to set this to let's do 800 pixels. I'm just choosing like a sort of big number. It's a little bit arbitrary, but because the website is really simple, I don't need to use all this space. So I'm just using this 800 pixels. So now notice that my content moves when I resize my window. And so it's only ever going to be 800 pixels wide, but it will, it won't get bigger than the window. Another thing that I can do here that's a little bit more modern is I can set a max width. So this way it will get smaller, but it won't get bigger. And so if I do this, now you'll see it starts to get smaller, like the text still, goes on to the next line, but it won't get bigger than that 800 pixels. And so now that I have that, see I have this ID container here and those rules here, see that margin auto, it's automatically creating the margin based on the width. And so now, this H1, I think the margin doesn't really make sense here. So I'm going to get rid of that rule for my H1. I'm going to go to margin here, and I'm just going to comment that out. So I may not have explained what I did there. That is, I'm just hitting Command ? And that adds these little comment things around here. So it leaves it there in case I want to bring it back later, but it doesn't actually get read when it adds the CSS. So this is a little bit of a better layout, but now the problem is, now we have this coupling between the HTML and CSS. So the HTML is expecting, or the CSS is expecting there to be this div container that doesn't exist on these other HTML pages. So now I have to make another update to my HTML pages to make this all work. So let's do that real quick, and then we'll be ready to move on. So this will also be just a good way to review this. So if I want to add a div around my content, I add a new HTML tag. I say div ID equals container. And I need to use that container so it knows which div it is. And then I'm going to indent everything in here so I can see visually where this container starts and ends. Then I'm going to go to a new line and just close that div. And if you click on the div, it should underline the div that it connects to. And again, if you have a more complex website, you can have as many divs as you want. But for us, we're keeping things very simple. Let's do that one more time. So I'm going to say div ID equals container. And then we're going to go to the end and, whoops, I accidentally opened the settings. I'm going to close that div. Notice if you don't do the formatting, it puts it over here because it's going to base it on what's here. So now I'm just going to go to each line and hit tab to move it over. And there we go. Now that looks good. So that's everything that I want to do. This is very simple, but it gives us this basic layout. We don't have to make anything too crazy because we're just making kind of a very simple choose your own adventure story for our project. All right, so this is it for our CSS that we're going to cover, but I want to do some documentation. So I'm going to take some screenshots of the website, and then I'm going to post those on the blog, and I'll submit that for our weekly blog. So we have one more week of web after this where we're going to add media, and then we'll finish our web project. So I want to make this look good. I'm going to pull this browser tab out on its own, and I'll make it a little bit smaller because I don't need kind of that extra space on the side. And then I'm going to use my screenshot tool on the Mac. So I'm going to open up Screenshot using my Spotlight. You can open it however. And I'm going to go to Screenshot window. And so that'll let me select this window. I'm going to click to capture. And then I'm going to go to the next one. And I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to go to Screenshot. And I'm just going to capture this window. And I'm going to do it one more time. Go to screenshot. Oh, whoops, I need to go to animator. And I'll go to screenshot and capture this window. So I'm just using Spotlight. I'm using a shortcut, but what I'm using is this Spotlight button up here. So it's the same thing. You can go to screenshot here, but you can open it up using your app launcher or however else you want to use it. And so we've got a few screenshots. Those are going to show up on my desktop. I'm going to throw this tab back into the Chrome block there. And now I'll make my weekly post about my website. So on our blog, I'll go to add a post. And I'm going to say website CSS update. And for this, I'm going to choose the category. I'm going to say weekly blog post and website. And now I'm going to add my screenshots. So you can drag and drop or add them from the interface. So I'm just going to drag these guys on here. And they're pretty small in this gallery view. So if you drag them all together, it's going to make a gallery view. And it looks pretty small, but if you want to kind of fix that, you can go to the block over here. And the thing is, you have to select the gallery, which can be kind of tricky to select in the editor. Okay, so if I select one of these and then click on this little gallery tab, then I can set the columns to 1. Since the images, there's not that much information in the images, but when they're small, it's very hard to see. So I want to add those. So once you've done that, add any updates or changes you've made to your project. So this week I added some CSS and added pages to my website. Just talk about the story that you're working on and any pages that you might have added or any ideas that you've had. And that's going to be good for this update. So you can click publish. And as usual, the last step. Oh, actually, I forgot to. Did I forget to update my GitHub? I did. That's okay. We're gonna do that now. So we'll leave this here. We'll edit this in a second. Remember, we have to update our GitHub. So let's go to a new tab. And let's go to github.com. And I've got to sign in. And let's go find our project. So mine is under MMP 100 Fall 2025. And we're going to upload. So you can actually drag and drop directly onto GitHub. It's going to let you do that. Just remember that you want to upload the files, not the containing folder. So if I go back to my desktop, go to web. I don't want to drag web. That's just going to make a web folder. What I want is to drag just the files that match here. So these have all changed. So I'm going to drag them all. You can also do them one at a time. But if I drag them on here, oh, it's not actually letting me do that. Okay, maybe I have to upload it here. Or I can go to add file. Let's go to upload files. For some reason, I thought it would let me drag on here. Maybe it used to and it doesn't anymore. Anyway, go to upload files and drag it here and just add a commit message. So I'm going to say add CSS styles. If you added other stuff, you can do that and click commit changes. And remember, this is going to take a minute or two, so your website won't update automatically, but you'll be able to look at your commits and see what's changed. So if I go in here and I click on, it has index.html open, you can see that I added the container here. You can see that I added the link to the style sheet here. And this is a completely new site. So you can actually see all the changes that you made to the website if you look at your commits. And this will show you the process of building the web page. So once this is done, it'll update our web page. And we can find this here. If we go to deployments, it'll go to GitHub pages, and there's our website. And it looks like it's actually already updated, so it must have just finished. So in our blog post, remember to include a link to the website itself. They'll say, here's a link to the site and a link to your GitHub repo. And so for the GitHub repo, just go to the main page of your GitHub where it says code and copy that link in there. So yeah, I forgot to do that. So let's just save that And then we can take this post. I'm going to open this in a new tab and make sure you can check on those links and make sure they work. And then we can send this to Brightspace. So I'm going to copy this, go to Brightspace, go to assignments, and I'm going to scroll down and look for the Choose Your Own Adventure draft and double check the rubric, make sure you've got everything, and then just paste that link in there and click submit. And so yeah, that's it for this week. Next week, we'll go over how to add images and media onto your website, and we'll talk about submitting the final version of the website. So I will see you guys next week.